And we're live. We're back. We've already started, but now we're going to restart. All right, so watercolor, light washes in the back, meaning a lot of water, right? And as I'm coming more towards the foreground, you can see it right in the foreground. This is the most paint that I have in the wash, right? So sometimes I will start from both ends of the spectrum. I'll start with like finding the darkest one I want to do, but anytime I'm painting, like I always start in the back with my lightest, and then I keep adding pigment as I come forward, yeah? Because I can almost always add pigment, but it's hard to take it out. You have to keep adding water, yeah? So, so real quick, let's do this. And then the nice thing about this pen is that it's waterproof, right? So just grab this pen. And you guys can keep the pens. I think I have enough to hand out. Everybody can get a pen, right? I actually love this pen. They're actually, hopefully you can get them around here, I think. Yeah. That way you can always remember me and SketchUp. Yeah, Trimble SketchUp. Brought to you by Trimble SketchUp. So watch. I just want you to make 3 boxes, yeah? Don't worry, you don't have to draw them perfectly like this. You can do them in a line if you want. The main thing we're doing here is we're just putting these out so we can paint them. We're going to kind of play around with this and see how it feels. So we got our water, right? So watch, and then for the background, what I want you to do is I want you to do 3 values here, right? We're going to do the background, midground, and foreground, okay? So these brushes are small, so it's going to be hard to move a little bit of the water, but I want you to get a decent puddle of water out here, yeah? So you might actually, because our brush is so small, I might actually just dump a little bit, right? Not too much. But just so I'm starting to get a big enough puddle that I can, that wash is going to be the same right now. Right? What I'll do is I'll test it on the side. It looks a little dark for the background, but let's test it. Even anytime I'm painting, like in my sketchbook, you'll see I have a lot of, if I'm actually trying to figure out the exact colors that I want, like to the sides of the paper, I'll just kind of have a little area where it's off the sketch, yeah? So something over here, we can just kind of test it and say, oh, that's actually not too bad, yeah? It might look a little light there or a little dark, but it's actually pretty light. So I might add a little bit more water up here. And then let's go ahead. I'm using this flat brush, yeah, because what we'll do is we'll do a wash and then we'll let it dry and we'll try to paint over the top of it, yeah? All right, so once you have a pretty light wash, test it again. That looks pretty light. But honestly, some of this is really just preference and learning how to do it, right? Look at that, though. Woo. And look, this is what I love about watercolor. See all that little gradient of light to dark? Yeah, so cool. So now sometimes it's hard to work with though, because you're like, oh no, I want to control it more. But sometimes it's awesome because it does all these little subtleties, you know. And for like trees, I think you were doing some trees, right? It's really nice because you can get a lot of different gradients, like like really easily. All right, so once we do one, and don't worry, you guys can do like if you mess up, just do another one. Really, I just want you kind of playing with it and try to figure out that relationship between. How dark does the wash need to be in order to get midground, right? And then how dark it needs to be to get that foreground, right? Background, midground. So that's always the thing I'm doing, is just playing around and figuring out how much pigment I need to get the depth I want. So that's a little light. I'm going to add a little bit more pigment to this. And all I do is touch my brush on there. Now, if your paint dries, the nice thing about this, if your paint dries, right, it'll be okay because all you do is put more water back on it. You see my paint palette, it's all dried, but it came out of a tube when I originally started, yeah? So this should work for my mid layer. Right now, also if I paint it and then I'm like, well, you know, that's still a little bit too light, you can come in, snag a little bit of pigment and actually just drop it in there. And now watch, if it's depending on how wet that paper is how much it's going to spread, right? When working with watercolor, it's always the thing of how much water and how much pigment, yeah? If you guys are just coming in, you guys can come grab some supplies. Okay? So there's my mid-ground. And then also, like, maybe I'm like, that might be a little dark. I always have a paper towel, so when I'm outside, I can, you know, clean my head. Or I can blow my nose, right? Yeah. No, but I use it to kind of pick up, if it gets too dark, you can actually come in and pick up some pigment. You see that? Mm-hmm. Oh, so nice. And then also, if I want to clean off my brush, you can do that too. Cool? Now, your wash, so a wash is like a big kind of, what is it? It's like a lot of water and a lot of pigment, right? Versus like if you're coming in and doing detail, once that dries, we'll come in and try to paint some detail over the top of it and look at the difference there. Because there's a couple of different techniques that we'll talk about. We'll talk about wet on wet technique, yep, and then wet on dry, right? And so wet on wet, if it's wet and I'm trying to paint over it, it's going, the paint's going to blend, right? It's going to mix. Exactly. And sometimes you want that. Sometimes it looks really cool when you do that. But then there's also times when you want your background wash to dry completely and then paint over the top of that, yeah? That's why yesterday when I was painting, like on that first painting, it was blazing hot, right? I got a sunburn on my neck. But I'll survive. I'm okay. I'm okay. But yes, so it wasn't, you know, like right here, this is an example where I could have a very straight line because all my washes in the background had already dried, right? And then over here, you can see where I had some stuff where it was kind of wet, and so it's a little bit more smudgy, like there's not a clean cut line on the edge of it. But I kind of like that for this little building thing, shack thing. Okay? So yeah, we'll do some of that. Hopefully, if our thing's dry enough. All right, so let's do our next foreground wash. Now, for this one, I'm going to add a good bit of pigment, yeah? And sometimes I'm almost going like straight pigment with just a little bit of water on it. Let's see how dark that is. Oh, we can go darker than that. Now also the size of your brush is going to impact how much water it holds, right? These brushes are pretty small, which means they're great to travel with, but they don't hold much water, right? Another way of telling how wet or dry something is if it's shiny, right? You see how the second two washes I did are really shiny? But look at this, the third one is not completely dry, but it's definitely not shiny, right? Because remember, when you're working with watercolor, figuring out how dry it is, because the drier it is, the drier the surface that you're adding paint to, the more control you're going to have, yeah? Now, a lot of times while I'm painting, you know what? I should do a little thing down here so we can do an example of wet on dry. This thing's almost dry, so I'm going to be able to show an example right there, but I was going to do another one here. I also thoroughly like, there's a lot of Asian artists that I follow, and they do a lot of the splatters, you know? which is great fun. So you can splatter like this, right? Or you can splatter, you can actually take the brush and go and get all those little tiny fleas, termites, right? So a lot of times that'll trick your eye or the viewer when they're looking at that into thinking, oh, there's a lot more detail there than there is, because your eye is kind of seeing that. But so watch. Now the neat thing also about splatters, it can kind of show a little bit of this idea of wet on wet. Actually, let me do 2 spots right down here. So that'll be wet on dry. I'm going to do wet on wet right here. So depending how dry this thing gets, and there's actually been times if I'm using this for like an illustration, like if I'm in my studio, I'll actually get a hairdryer or hold it in front of a fan. Yeah? Yeah, put it in the sun because it'll dry so much faster. If it's really humid, if it's raining, like one time I was doing painting in like the jungle of Costa Rica. It's like a rainforest, so it's so humid, and I would just have to paint and then like set it down and just leave because it would never dry, and so then everything would just muddy together, you know, get really muddy. So but here I'll come up here. So wet on wet, we'll come down and use some of these. These will be somewhat wet and then really wet, right? But look, this one is actually dry. I can actually feel that it's dry. So then watch, if I'm doing a wet on dry, a wet on dry, I'm doing wet wash on a dry background. I'm gonna have a lot of control, right? Whoosh, right? There's no bleeding on the edge of that line. There we go, right? It's very straight. Now watch, also with this one, so a nice pointed brush, if I use this guy, I can do some really nice details. And this is also what I love to do with a brush. Hopefully you can press it down and get a thicker line and then a thinner line. Ooh. See that? And if you get too much, it'll bleed everywhere, so just do a little bit. Right? So a nice pointed brush will give you some details, and a flat brush or a bigger brush will give you some larger washes, yeah? But that's a pretty good example of wet on dry, right? So we have a dry wash. And then now look, these are in various shades of drying, right? Like they're still there. You can see. I don't know if you can see. They're still a little bit shiny. Yeah. So let's come in and see the difference. Let's do that same thing up there. If we come right through here, let's try maybe top to bottom. Yeah. I'm going to make sure I don't have too much pigment on there. Touch it on there. If I come down here, whoosh, it's kind of. There you go. So look, you can see that how that line is running a lot, right? I don't have a clean edge on the edge of that, right? Depending on how wet. Look, so down here, this is starting to dry a little bit more. I'll come down here and do another one right here. So that's pretty dry now, yeah? So my edges are nice and controlled. Over here, still a little bit wet, right? And you'll start to see the edges, yeah, like this one's, look, completely dissolving, right? Because of all the water. If you're coming in late, grab some supplies up here, yeah? We'll do it for another few minutes. Cool? So that's wet on wet. And depending on how much you want to bleed and to flow, then you'll apply a second wash when it's still wet, yeah? Or if you want them to mix, right? That's also one of the things I really like to do is if I'm using multiple colors, if I do it, let me see if I got a good example. I can get multiple colors to blend together and to kind of push and pull colors mixing. So I don't do a lot of, oh yeah, okay. Well, so this one, look. So on this guy, I was trying to keep some of this, this is a flowering tree back in Georgia, yeah? Ooh, it doesn't really show, color-wise it doesn't show very well, but like you can see, so this was all wet when I applied my shadow, so it kind of started to bleed more versus like, oh, and this one too has kind of got a bit of a blending of my shadow, yeah? Versus areas where it was really dry and I did shadowing and it became really clear, yeah? Oh, this is a good one that shows some of it. It's a little bit more stark too, yeah? So look, you can see there's different gradients of color in here, right? This is brown and then a blue. So, and I love doing browns and blues to get a nice grayish black, yeah? I don't actually have a black paint. I always just mix it with my browns and my blues because then it gives my black a little bit more life to it, yeah? So that's kind of the neat thing about watercolor and figuring out how, this was actually a rainy day. This is like a big bus station in Athens where I live. And so, yeah, so I wanted to use all these dark colors and actually do a lot of wet on wet technique so that it would, I don't know, just kind of look rainy, I guess. Some of this through here, I had to let it dry because I wanted to draw some of these things really exactly, right? Or more exactly than like this background wash. Okay? Cool? So that's wet on wet, right? And then up here we've got, this is just kind of our 1, 2, 3. This is our, kind of background. Midground. And then foreground, right? You guys understand those, right? Foreground, right? Yeah, okay, cool. Okay? And so you see, like, I love this too. Like, I'm a big fan, anytime I'm doing, I'm teaching drawing, I always talk about line width, right? Variable line width. Remember we did that with the pencils, right? So the same thing, we can get the same thing with our watercolor, which is pretty awesome. So this guy's probably dry now. But now, I drew this over the top of it, yeah? But now it's actually these two elements are now being pulled forward, aren't they? So these guys look like they're advancing or coming towards me beyond what that background is, because those are actually like a midground color, aren't they? And now I had us do 3 values, but you can do 5, like whatever. I just think when you're first learning it, when you do your sketch, if you can just try to simplify it, if you look at it and you're like, okay, that's background, maybe this tree is also in the background, and then maybe these 3 or this building are coming into the midground, and then the foreground I've got some really darks all the way up front. Okay, it's helpful to kind of break it down into those 3 different colors. Here's another example of that. Right, so I've got, let me pull this up. So I've got this back here. See all my background? It's really light blue, yeah? And then as I'm coming forward, I'm just adding more pigment, right? So even here, you can see I've added pigment from this point down because it's coming towards me. I'm adding a little bit more blue, a little bit more blue. And then in the foreground, right here up front, this is actually why I wanted to sketch this spot, because there's these white columns and then these really neat shadows on them, yeah? So then I'm just mixing up tons of pigment and really strong blue, and I'm coming in and doing these guys. Now, just because I'm using a lot of one of the color, right, doesn't mean I'm going to fill in the whole thing. Like, what draws your eye is the contrast, yeah? And with a really dark blue next to a white, you get high contrast, which pulls your eye to it, yeah? So in the foreground, I think I mentioned this yesterday, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end of today, when we're going to draw a perspective together. But in my background, I have less detail, right? And in my foreground, I have more detail, right? You can see all this. I'm getting really detailed in the shadow and even in the bricks, right? And in the background, I'm just like, yeah, the bricks are that color and the trees are really simple, right? So less detail, less contrast. Do you guys know what contrast is? Yeah? Okay. I never know how much like art teaching people know, but contrast is just the difference between a dark and a light, right? Black and white have incredibly high contrast in colors, yeah? So this one's like a really dark blue, and the next one a really white. So it brings contrast, it draws your eye to it. So I'll do really high contrast, more detail up front, less contrast, less detail in the back. And then that starts to build depth and really kind of give you that, that depth, okay? Good? So let's kind of put all this together in a quick little sketch. Did you still have room at the bottom of your page? Okay, watch. We're just gonna do this for an example, yeah? And you don't have to draw this perfectly, but what I want you to do, watch me draw it first, and then I want you to draw something like this. So let's go ahead and draw like a quick tree, maybe this tree. Do you guys know the rule of thirds? Uh-oh. So the rule of thirds, like a composition will look really nice if you put your main subject like a third of the way to the middle. Not in the middle. You want to split your composition, whatever your sketch is, into thirds, right? So if you did one here and one here, if you choose one of those locations, the composition will look really nice. So watch, we're just going to put a tree right here. I'm going to do a foreground tree. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, right? But I'm going to do this foreground tree right here. And these pens are pretty nice because you can get a decent amount of line variation with it, yeah? We'll put this branch here to here. Oh, and look, there's going to be, of course, what's this guy? Come on, you know. Agapanthus africanus. Right? So we got some of those. This is my foreground stuff. Okay, we're going to do that. So and you can just draw a tree or a couple of shrubs. So that'll be our foreground, yeah? Then watch, we'll do a midground back here. Let's say that there's a little, like, I don't know, maybe there's like some sort of slope coming down like this. That's just going to be our midground. Watch, my trees back here are going to be pretty simple, right? Because they're a little ways away. Maybe there's a little clump over here. Some shrubbies. Some other shrubs. There's another tree. Maybe a tree behind that. Sure. Something like that, right? So there's my midground. Now watch. Look at this in the background. Ready? What is this one? Mount Kenya or Kilimanjaro. Oh, Kilimanjaro. Oh, that's like, there is one peak that has that on Kilimanjaro. I think. I saw a picture. But, right? So there's our background. Yes? Oh, maybe we need, that's pretty far in the background. Maybe you could do another line here. Right? But if that's too complicated, just do, I'll draw another one over here. You got a tree, right? Foreground, midground. I don't want you to spend tons of time on the drawing, right? I just want to have it there so we can, and then we'll do something in the background, yeah? Maybe there's another level right here. Okay? Something like that? Good? So just draw that real quick and then we'll just paint them together using what we've learned. Something simple. Did everybody, folks who are coming in, everybody got supplies? Okay, good. Good? We got it, right? Okay, cool. So now if you want to, you can maybe sketch it again after we paint, because if I'm doing a quick demo, I sometimes like to have two drawings because one of them is going to take too long to dry, right? So let's work up a wash for our background, yeah? Because I always start background to foreground, okay? And my desk is sloped a little bit, so all my paint's going down here. But you can also use these other ones over here if you want to make a really light wash. Remember, the brushes are kind of hard to move water with, so you might want to just do a little bit of drop in there. And then you can add some pigment to that. And I'll test it. If it's too much water, it's going to bleed everywhere. So let me see. Oh boy, is that going to be good. So we'll have a couple of washes. Maybe we'll do 5 different washes, because the sky, I really want it to be light, yeah? And I want there to be a bunch of contrast. So I'm going to do even more water for the sky, yeah? It's a really light wash. And then watch, here we go. Let's do it. Now, I'm going to have my brush jumping around a little bit, just like I do when I'm painting. Or I mean, just like I do when I'm sketching with a pencil, yeah? But I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The trick with a small brush too, or a problem with a small brush, is that if you're trying to cover a big area, you can end up getting a lot of brush strokes in there, right? And sometimes you just want it to read as like a big wash, you know, not with a bunch of brush strokes. But anyway, so look, there's our thing. Now watch, I like to, if I can, I'll tilt my paper up a little bit so that the top of my sky is a little darker like we saw yesterday, right? And then it's a little bit lighter as it comes down. You can also come in, not too much water, but you can actually add a little bit of water to that wash and pull it all the way down to the bottom there. And anywhere I leave a gap in there, it's going to give you a nice little cloud-looking thing, right? And if it's too much, right? If I have too much water, especially for this demo, I want it to go pretty quick. So I'm going to come in just with the corner. I'm going to pick up some of that right there. Okay. Also move it around, shake it a little bit. Look at that. Now sometimes if I don't have time, if I only have time to paint one thing, did you get some paints? They're over here. Then sometimes I'll just do the sky, because sometimes that just looks cool. All right, next wash. Now look, the top of my wash up here is still wet. All along here, still wet, yeah? But the bottom, that looks good. So I'm going to come in and do my trees. My mountains. Mount Kenya. In the middle of Kenya is a mountain. A giant mountain. Oops, I don't want to get too dark, because it is hard to make sure I don't get too dark. But I want those mountains to jump out and have a darker value than the sky, right? So there's that. Sometimes, look, so I have this tree right here. That tree is going to have gaps in it where you're going to see through it, right? So I'm just going to paint some of these, because the wash I'm going to use for that foreground is going to be really dark. It's going to cover up all those lighter washes behind it. So I'm not worried about it being hidden. And then look, I've got this little, I don't know if you did a mountain and then a little, the little layer. I guess it's like a mid ground. I'm going to kind of, oops, too much water. I'm going to keep coming forward and adding a little bit more pigment to my washes as I'm coming forward. I still have some of those washes that I made, right? I got that one for dark. medium, kind of, you know. I like to check them on the side right here, but I should be able to keep coming forward with this. Adding a little bit more. Well, those look about the same, but that's all right. Okay, now watch this, watch this. It's still a little bit wet right there, right? So I gotta let it dry just a little bit, because what I want to do is actually try to pull a wash for the whole way and add pigment to the bottom. That'll be great. This is when you want to be listening to an audiobook or some music. Oh, what's that?
When you're doing this?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of audiobooks, yeah. Or the neat thing is often if you're sketching with people, then you're just able to talk and like let the thing dry, catch up. Right? So if I started painting right down here, I'm going to get a little bit of bleeding, yeah? Or blending. Because mine's still, you can see it's still shiny, right? So, but I'm going to wait one more second, and then I'm going to paint, because I want these guys to have a really clean edge. Like, I want there to be really sharp contrast between the mountains and the trees, right? But watch this. I'm actually going to come in. I don't mind these guys. This is going to bleed a little bit, I think, along this edge, but I'm okay with that. As long as I'm adding more pigment, it should actually give us some depth. Projector's out. Did I kick it? No, the light's on. Well, we'll just let our washes dry, huh? But this is also why sometimes I'll have a second one, because I'll be too impatient to let it dry, and then I'll start painting and it'll all blend together and get muddy. Like muddy meaning it's just not clear where I want it to be, right? Coming back. I did say we were starting at 9:15, right, for SketchUp, right? Okay, good. That's perfect, yeah. We're wrapping this up. We're on it. Yeah? You got to keep me timely. Okay, we're back. So, let's come in here. We're going to do this, because this is like mid-ground, right? But then we're coming forward with it. We're going to add pigment. Boom. Ooh, that's too much. Got to spread that out a little bit. What I want it to do is I want it to blend see how that little gradient right there? Gradient meaning it's dark here and lighter back there. Super nice, right? So at this point I'd want to tilt my page down a little bit to let that most of the pigment come to the foreground, yeah? Then I'm going to use kind of a light wash to bring this side in too. We'll come back for those trees in just a minute. But you have to be careful. If I touch all this dark stuff, it's just going to smear, yeah? So I'm actually going to leave a little bit of white space right there. Right in between those two, the last bit of painting I did and then this one, yeah? Don't worry, if yours doesn't look like mine, it's also because I've been doing this for 20 years, yeah? So, watercolor in particular is hard to control, yeah? That's also really cool because you can get some really neat, like, you know, special things that can happen only with watercolor, so. Like this sort of blending here. It's hard to do with acrylics or other medium. Okay. Now look, I'm going to use that same kind of wash, that same color, to do my do this tree. Now this isn't going to be the darkest value in the trees, or in this tree, but I'm going to go ahead and use that. It's kind of a mid-tone blue. I'm going to leave some gaps like that. Now it's not popping out that much, is it? Don't worry, don't worry. We're going to let that dry, and then we're going to come in with a really dark blue and kind of finish up the whole thing, yeah? For that foreground to jump out. We also need to, depending on how wet the your paper is, I'm going to come in and use that same kind of mid value on these trees. But remember, I don't want a lot of detail on those trees because they're further back than this one, right? So I'm just going to kind of outline them as a big blob. Or just a big mass form, yeah? So right now there's very little variation in color between here and like here and here, right? And there should be a lot, right? But that's okay. We're going to come back in, we're going to let this dry for a second, and then we'll come back in and we'll do some really darks to make it pop forward. Come on, dry. We gotta do SketchUp. Now, can I always blow on it a little bit? You know it's working? You know it's working when you start to feel lightheaded, right? Then you're like, this is good. All right, so look. Mine's pretty dry, but look, there's a couple areas where I don't want it to bleed, so I can come in, especially when I'm sketching, I can just dry some of these things. It might pull up a little bit of pigment, but that's okay. I'm going to pull up some of this over here because it's just taking a little long. We got lots to do today. All right, so then I'm going to mix up a really good, almost pure pigment. Look at this thing. Whoosh, whoosh. Oh. I know. It's a lot. Let's use this guy too, yeah? Did you guys get one of these? Hope you did. Because look, you'll actually see, sometimes I'll actually come over here, you can see there's a little bit of water on that paint. So it's highly concentrated. Look at that. Let's do that on this tree. Ready? Remember the umbrella, underside of the umbrella is going to be dark. This is our foreground tree, so plenty of color on this. Sorry, there you go. And then I forgot my agapanthus in this one, so I'll just come in and hint at them. Okay, foreground. And the midground needs a little love too, because it's looking too much like the background, isn't it? I know. All right, let's do it. You saw it. So let's come in and add a little bit more. This is wet on dry, right? So I can add a little bit more pigment and it won't bleed as much. I like that. And my trees are still kind of wet, so I'm going to put a decent amount of pigment in here. And let it bleed a little bit. But if it gets too dark, it's going to look like the foreground, right? Don't do that. Yeah, mine's a little dark, so I'm going to come in. Take some of that up. But I do need a nice shadow right there coming down. Okay. Foreground, midground, background, right? A couple layers within those, but hopefully that helps. Yeah. And honestly, look, see, this is still wet on mine. I don't know if you can tell, but this is still wet. I would still come in once it dries and make a couple of really sharp details in here, because this is still wet, so it bled a little bit. I like these really sharp details in my foreground, right? But for now, we're going to leave it so we can jump into SketchUp, yeah? Good? Yeah. Questions on watercolor? Anything? Okay, hope it was good. Isn't it fun? Wow. It's fun and or horrible. What's that? Oh man, so for me, when I first started drawing, and it's funny because when I look at Godolgo's sketchbook too, he's very precise in a lot of things too, you know, and like that's how I actually, that's my first way of drawing, is very precise. Then I've been working like over the years of kind of loosening up a little bit, but I would be trying to paint something and I was like, no, like that's not supposed to bleed. It's supposed to go over this way. And I'm like, you know, and you sometimes with watercolor you can't control it as much. But that's also the beauty of watercolor, is because it kind of does its own thing and it can look really, really interesting. So, yep. All right, SketchUp, yeah? Let's do it. I said that, but now I'm painting. There we go. So maybe at least put your water somewhere where it isn't going to spill on your SketchUp stuff, yeah? And the easy thing, if you still have some paper towel left, just leave that big gob of paint and just clean up your washes, yeah? And you're ready to go. And then ultramarine actually tastes a little bit like blueberry. Finish it, finish it. I don't know what it has in it. You probably don't want to drink that. But you could probably use it to make cement, right? I mean, we saw what they were using yesterday, so this will work.